the program, we're looking at this program. We'll have Alex Wolf from Scenic Hudson and Heather Ferrero from Livingston County, who's going to be talking about the solar projects and initiatives that they're working on. The presentation will be recorded and it will be up on the GISSIG website. Also, some GIS housekeeping. The conference is going to be in the fall, the day before GS Day, so November 16th, I believe. So look for more information on that in the upcoming weeks and months. So, and with that, I will pass it to Alex and Heather to take it away.
Great, thanks, Justin. I am Heather Ferrero. I'm the Deputy Director in the Planning Department of Livingston County, and I'll start off our little show today. Well, I'll be talking about solar in our region and in Livingston County in particular, and then I'll hand it over to Alex, who is going to give a presentation on the Scenic Hudson solar mapping tool, which I think is a great resource for us, and we can use it in our region as well. So I'm going to start with my slideshow. Okay, hold on. All right, here's the slideshow. I hope you can see my screen. The talk was originally called Here Comes the Sun, Solar Development in the GISSIG region, but then I realized that I ripped off the title from a Genesee Finger Lakes Regional Planning Council presentation, unintentional. It was just in my head when I thought solar. So it's a slightly different title now. What you're seeing here is just some generic pictures of solar panels, some pollinators, solar panels on a landscape, and this bottom right picture is actually a solar development that's been installed in Caledonia on Route 5. This is right next to a gravel pit, and it looks like it's drawn in, but those are actual installed. Our first solar project that was installed is about 5 megawatts. So I'll go through solar in the region. A big driver for solar development in the region is New York State. New York State passed a Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in 2019, though solar has been active in our region before that. Livingston County has been dealing with solar since at least 2016. But in 2019, there was this clean energy requirements were set, goals. So 70% of electricity from renewables would be implemented by 2030. And you can see all the rest of the bullet points there. It's an ambitious climate leadership, climate protection. It calls for 6,000 megawatts of solar and 3,000 megawatts of energy storage capacity by 2025. 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. So New York has set these goals and has provided financial incentives to help achieve these goals, which is why we're seeing solar and wind energy development across the state. Just so that we can all be on the same page here, there's 3 kind of scales of solar development that are involved in today's solar development. You have your typical residential or small commercial, even agricultural accessory uses, which help to power that residence, that commercial facility, or that agricultural facility. Those are your typical solar panels on your roofs, in the backyard, small scale solar. Usually that's handled by a town without even having to go before a planning board. Anything accessory is very small scale and is handled differently than these other 2 bullets. The second bullet is your commercial industrial scale. And the focus of this is to have solar panels for resale to the grid, right? It's not necessarily for what's being used on site. It's put in so it can be sold to the grid. This would be generally, we've seen the smallest at about a 2 megawatt project, all the way up to a 25 megawatt project, or just under 25. The third scale is your large utility scale. This is your anything over 25 megawatts. So as a point of reference, for every megawatt generated, that typically translates into roughly 5 acres per megawatt. So your larger scale projects would be here in the large utility. Now, New York State allows municipalities to regulate the commercial industrial scale projects through zoning. As long as it's not overly restrictive, towns generally have a good control ability over commercial industrial scale. That's anything in that 2 megawatt to just under 25 megawatt scale. The larger utility projects, though, typically go through what's called the Article 10 process for the scale of project, but also they've come up with some new regulations. They're coming up with new regulations, which is we refer to as 94C. It's section 94C. That says that the state is in charge of locating this scale of solar development, and the municipalities have a less of an input as to where these go. Though, as we'll talk about, towns and villages, if they have a solar law that says what they want, those regulations have to be considered in the siting process. So this is just a background of what we'll be discussing from here. Just as a kind of a primer, and I took this from the Scenic Hudson solar mapping tool. Thank you, Alex. Just to get us all on boards, the way solar energy development happens. You have the sun, which is converted into energy at the panel level, goes to a substation, and then is sent, it goes by distribution lines to a substation, then the substation goes to transmission lines. In the beginning, I should say solar development has changed monthly, if not weekly, from 2016. In 2016, we were worked up about 10-acre solar projects. That was what was on board. That's what we were told, that the industry would cap themselves at 5 megawatt projects. They couldn't handle more than that. And it would all be within a mile or 2 miles of substations that are existing right now. Since that time, you're not tied to a substation, right? You can, the companies can build their own substations, or they can hook up in proximity to these transmission lines. The key we're finding now is the transmission lines. And the next slide shows why solar is locating in Western New York. This is a screenshot from the Scenic Hudson solar mapping tool of all of the high-powered transmission lines in Western New York. And you can see the GISSIG region is where my cursor is right now. But we're crisscrossed with transmission lines, which makes it easier to transport the power to the grid. And I should say, this is what really intrigued me about the solar mapping tool, is that even though it's geographically specific to the Hudson River with all of their layers, some of their layers, you can go into this tool and just pan west, and you can take advantage of some of the power generation layers, like transmission lines. It'll tell you where 1, 2, and 3 gauge electric or phase electric lines are. It's a really useful tool. So the next slide gets into what kind of development in solar we have now in the region. Now, there's a lot of words here, but what this basically breaks down to is each county has a certain number of projects in that 2 to 25 megawatt range. And then the counties also have projects that are in that large utility scale. And you'll see there's a lot of solar development in our region. To note, Ontario County, Yates County don't have any Article 10 projects right now, but I'm going to go back to that transmission line. If you look at Ontario County and Yates, well, Ontario County anyways, less transmission lines. That's not to say it won't happen there, but right now, no Article 10 or 94C large scale projects in those counties. Whereas Livingston County, we have 3 of those large scale projects. And I know in Genesee it's showing 1, but there's also 2 to 3 more in development there. So this is a snapshot in time that will be obsolete tomorrow. Going to the bottom of the slide to draw your attention, there are 134 of those projects that are within the 2 to 25 megawatt range. 12 projects are in that large scale utility range. For those 12, they are scheduled to generate more than 1,800 megawatts. Now, New York State's goal is to have 6,000 megawatts of solar. We are contributing in Western New York quite a lot towards that megawatt goal. Now, why is this? What kind of impact did this have? Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, every megawatt generated typically translates into 5 acres of 5 acres. So 1,800 megawatts translates into over 9,000 acres in solar development in our region. And the acreage and the megawatts don't even count the 134 of the commercial industrial solar projects. So there's a large impact in our region from solar development. I'm not saying that's good or that's bad, it just is. If you have a goal of solar development, solar energy generation, there is going to be a land use impact. Now, New York State Energy Research Development Agency, NYSERDA, has a website. If you Google solar siting NYSERDA or solar project siting NYSERDA, you'll come up with this map. Not this particular map, but there's a website that'll show you solar siting in New York State. And I chose Livingston County. You can choose any county. You can choose the project sector. So I wanted to see commercial industrial, but you could see residential, small commercial, or all solar development. And then it shows you on the right-hand side what your capacity is, currently what you've completed, and what's in the pipeline. What is working its way through NYSERDA application and funding process that could come onto the landscape in the future. So for Livingston County, with 4 completed projects and with an additional probably 10 in the pipeline, that's a lot of projects. And you can see from the expected annual production of gigawatt hours, what we've completed and what we have in the pipeline, there's a lot of potential for energy production in Livingston County. And I went through each of our counties and it's a similar picture for each. So knowing that we had solar coming down the pike, and we saw this coming down the pike in 2016, I'm not going to go into solar regulations, but I show you this slide to let you know that these are all of our municipalities, and it shows the status of our solar regulation and our battery energy storage regulation. Most of our towns, and this is actually an outdated slide because Nunde just passed their solar law, and North Dansville is about to pass theirs too. But it's important to have solar land use regulations in place before you have a project come, because it's a pretty intense process for municipalities that don't have a lot of experience with projects of this type and size. There are some municipalities in our county who have outright prohibited large-scale solar, those large-scale projects. Now, as I mentioned, large-scale projects aren't cited at the municipal level. they're cited at the state level. So for example, the town of Ashen in their recently passed zoning regulations has said, we do not want any commercial, large scale or utility scale projects. And New York State, if you decide that you want to locate one of those projects here, here's 30 pages of regulations that we want you to consider. So they have 30 pages of regulations that they're hoping not to use and won't use in the daily parlance of solar. Okay, so we've had interns since the beginning of our solar development. We wanted to take a look at the coverage of Livingston County with solar. And what you're seeing here is all of the yellow with the white outlines is our active solar with applications into the municipality or our Article 10 94C large scale projects. And you can see the transmission lines are in the orange, and you can kind of tell why solar is locating where they're located. But why is it important to us to have a handle on solar regulations? Well, this map shows you why. This map shows you all of the prime soils and prime farmland and farmland of statewide importance in Livingston County. We are blessed with a natural resource of prime farm, best in the world. And it's large, open fields of well-drained land. And that is exactly what solar looks for as well. So there's a lot of solar going on to prime and statewide significant soils. Our intern took a look at that map on the previous slide and took all of those polygons and looked to see how much of that was on prime farmland, how much of it was on active farmland. And she came up with these statistics. This was Gabby Norbert of SUNY Geneseo, that we have right now in application potential 3,300 acres of solar development in Livingston County. This is outdated. We have more now. And of that, about 1,400 is on prime farmland and farmland of statewide importance. We use this to educate our municipalities as to where their natural resources are, and also to give them tools to write solar laws that they can choose what type of protection they would like for these prime soils. Everything from a town of York that says you can't locate on prime soils to an Avon that says you can locate on a percentage of those prime soils. The other mapping that we've done for our municipalities is we took those polygons that were generated, which are showing where the solar panels are located. This isn't the properties that are involved. This is actual solar panel location. And we clipped the prime farmland statewide soils layer. And then we also clipped the active agriculture. And you can see in Avon and Caledonia, where there are 5 solar projects, a lot of those solar projects are on prime farmland. Also, if it's green on the right, that means it's receiving an ag exemption, which only active agriculture can get an ag exemption. So it's active ag being transformed into solar. And another set of maps that we did was for Mount Morris and Leicester. You can tell not all of our solar is going on prime land. On the left-hand side, you see a lot of white. That shows the 5 projects in the Mount Morris Leicester area. They're not located on prime farmland. They have located the projects specifically to avoid prime farmland. Also on the right-hand side, you see that the red parcels are not in active ag. Everything else is. One last thing to note for mapping services that we provide to our towns. We take a look at all of our solar regulations and we put them into visual maps so that the municipalities can see what they are regulating, what their law translates into on the ground. So what you're seeing here is a town of Avon map that shows everything that's excluded from solar development. Everything that's white is available for solar development, like solar could locate there. This is when they first did their law and said, we want 500-foot setbacks from every property line. You can tell there's not a lot of land available for solar development. But then we also did a visual on 200-foot setbacks, which they were also considering. And that's the next slide, which shows, okay, take a picture of this one. When you have 200-foot setbacks, you have a lot more space for solar development. So this played into their decision on how to regulate for their solar law. And with that, I am done with my look at regional solar. I'll just put my contact information up there for a second. If you have any questions that need or would like some resources, feel free to reach out to me. And with that, I'm gonna send it over to Alex.
All right, thank you, Heather. Thanks for the invite to come present to the group today, and also for that great background. Really fascinating for me, you know, being in the Hudson Valley to get a glimpse of what's going on in Livingston County and you know, in your neck of the woods. Go ahead and start sharing my screen here. And hopefully everybody is seeing my my slideshow and not the presenter's notes. Just to get started, a little bit of background on who and what Scenic Hudson is. We are an environmental nonprofit advocacy group and a land trust based in the Hudson Valley. We do work in the area of about 10 counties of the tidal Hudson River from just north of New York City up into the Albany and Troy area. And our mission is to preserve land and farms and create parks that connect people with the inspirational power of the Hudson River while fighting threats to the river and the natural resources that are the foundation for the valley's prosperity. And I've included a picture here of Storm King Mountain in the Hudson Highlands. Scenic Hudson got its start in 1963, actually fighting Con Edison, who wanted to basically chop the top of that mountain off and put a hydropower plant there. And so our roots go back to, you know, fighting poorly planned power utility projects. And so why are we now in the business of promoting solar? Heather gave a great sort of overview of some of the state laws that have come into play and state policies that are advancing solar. And we really, in the big picture, you know, agree with these premises because we see climate change as an existential threat to everything that we've protected and to our way of life here in the Hudson Valley and across New York State. You know, we see rising sea levels in the Hudson River estuary that are threatening our towns. We see droughts and floods from climate change that are threatening our conserved green spaces, our parks, and our local farms as well. And so, you know, we want to see solar developed, but we want to see it developed responsibly. So we at Scenic Hudson believe that the Hudson Valley can be, you know, a model to the rest of the country of how to execute a swift and fair transition, a just transition to renewable energy, while at the same time doing it responsibly to conserve the ecological, agricultural, and cultural resources of our area. And I think everything I said really, you know, could apply to New York State and not just the Hudson Valley. You know, I'm sure all of you on the call are very fond of the places you live, as I am, and all of the resources that are there, and you know, hopefully agree that we need to do something about climate change and do it quickly. A difference between the Hudson Valley and Western New York, perhaps, is that we are faced primarily with solar development as the type of renewable energy that's really feasible here. I know you all have wind developments upstate as well, that the wind resources aren't quite as good in the Hudson Valley. So we deal a lot with solar. And so how are we going to execute this transition to renewable energies that the state is calling for without endangering the other things that we all care about? So to that end, we've developed our How to Solar Now toolkit. This is a toolkit to support stakeholder decision-making in the interest of helping the Hudson Valley be that regional model and responding to the climate crisis. And, you know, as far as solar is concerned, I think a lot of our tools apply to the Hudson Valley, but also to much of New York State as well. So within our toolkit, we've created a guide to solar siting. We did this back in 2018, and this deals with some of the issues that Heather was talking about with regard to setbacks, screening, things like that, when you get down to the site level, and doing smart from the start siting of solar. We've also developed a zoning resource. And again, it was developed with the Hudson Valley in mind, but probably a lot of it is applicable in some way to the rest of New York State, and all of our townships being home rule towns and having, some power, as Heather said, to regulate the types of solar that are developed. And our hope is that, municipalities are going to use these resources to get proactive and to try to pass whatever zoning revisions and code revisions they want to pass before projects are being proposed that maybe don't align with local priorities. And the final part of this How to Solar Now toolkit is the solar mapping tool, which Heather asked me to present about today. This was funded in part by the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, so we definitely appreciate their support in getting this tool up and running. And all these things are available at our website, howtosolarnow.org. So the solar mapping tool, it's a web-based online mapping and education platform. It's really an educational resource to help guide stakeholders with exploration and prioritization, and to inform the conversation and get different stakeholders on the same page and starting with the same information. We've seen some solar developers come in and sort of propose plans based on only their own priorities. And we've seen a lot of opposition from local stakeholders to that. We've also seen some developers that have tried to work with locals and align priorities better. And we hope that the solar mapping tool is gonna help everybody to get on the same page and find lots of win-win scenarios so that solar isn't bogged down in permitting processes and isn't facing a lot of opposition, but is finding good, responsible places to site these solar projects. So more specifically, we envision the solar mapping tool as supporting comprehensive planning and zoning, as helping everybody involved assess sites for potential solar development, and perhaps even to help communities set their renewable energy goals and develop climate action plans. We started developing the tool back in mid-2019, and from the start, we tried to involve stakeholders as much as possible. In some cases, for instance, for the agriculture and conservation stakeholder groups, we brought in experts to augment our knowledge about what data layers would be useful, would be best to represent the resources and interests of those groups. And in other cases, the municipal stakeholders, for instance, we were more asking, what they wanted to get out of the tool and how we could make it more useful. And to that end, we pilot tested the tool with 2 communities in the Hudson Valley, which had sort of different geographic profiles in terms of land use, extent of agriculture, topography, things like that. So I realize, this is a GIS group, so we have to talk about data layers. There are a lot of data layers in the solar mapping tool, at least for Hudson Valley coverage. And so we organize them into thematic groups. And you can sort of see those groups here. And we wanted to think carefully about which layers we were including and why. There are so many online mapping tools, and a lot of them are great. And as a GIS nerd myself, I love digging into different layers and comparing and contrasting. But we wanted the solar mapping tool to really work for people that are not used to looking at GIS all day. Your average user, whether that is a solar developer who maybe knows a lot about solar but not much about wetlands or agriculture, or whether it's the volunteer member of the local zoning board or planning board, we wanted the solar mapping tool to be accessible to everybody. And so we sort of approached it with some layer criteria in mind. We wanted the spatial scale to be appropriate to municipalities. So having a fine enough resolution that you can really zoom into a municipality scale or even a site scale and have appropriate resolution there for most layers. We heard from our municipal stakeholders that layers with regulatory status were important. So DEC wetlands, and Heather mentioned the agricultural districts with it, which has a tax status associated with it. So we made sure those were in there, things like that. We wanted layers with a clear relation to solar development. If we couldn't explain in fairly simple language why a layer was relevant to solar development, we didn't put it in this tool, as interesting as it may be for other uses. We wanted it, again, to be interpretable for non-experts, and we wanted the single best layer for each resource. And again, we're trying to reduce complexity and increase accessibility across different user groups. And so those prime farm soils and soils of statewide importance for farming are a great example. There are lots of different soil layers you can incorporate. And they may all mean something to an agricultural expert and not to the average solar developer or the average person on your zoning board. So we picked that single best layer. Same with forests. There are lots of interesting forest layers out there that are interesting to a forest ecologist or a conservation expert. But we picked one layer that we thought best represented large forest patches for most users. And finally, we did want to strive for replicability outside the region. So if one of you wants to build something like this for Western New York, that would be great. Nearly all of the layers in the tool are publicly available layers, and they're layers that have statewide coverage for the most part, if not national coverage. And I'll get into replicability a little bit at the end too. So this tool is built on Esri story map technology and templates. And we ended up, because there was so much content to cover on this topic, we ended up making 4 separate story maps, parts 1 through 4 of the tool. And parts 1 through 3 are really educational in nature. Part 4 is where the rubber meets the road and users can apply what they've learned in the first 3 parts. So I'll just give a quick overview on the 3 parts to give you an idea of what the tool is like. All 4 parts of the tool have a left side that has information and guidance of sort of what things are or what to be thinking about. The right side has featured content, pop-ups that we call info dives or interactive maps. And so, in part 1, we're just giving people a general background. A lot of the things that Heather did a great job covering in her presentation, what is solar, and the blue buttons here provide info dives, so you can get into kind of the nuts and bolts of different components of what goes into a solar installation. Or if you're not interested, you can keep on moving. We also do cover that size question, as Heather was talking about the different sizes and how they're phrased in terms of kilowatts and megawatts, which for a lot of people is hard to envision. And so, that 5 or, sometimes 6 acres per megawatt is a great rule of thumb, but we wanted people to be able to visualize, when somebody says, I want to build a 2 megawatt project or a 20 megawatt project, what does that look like on the ground? And so people can click and see, real life examples, most of them in New York State, of what these projects actually look like. So here's one from Saugerties, New York, with the Catskill Mountains in the background. That's what a 2 megawatt project actually looks like when it's said and done. Part 2 is all about smart solar planning, which is an approach we developed when we first started thinking about this project. We were coming at it from the standpoint of solar feasibility, which I think is where a lot of solar developers approach from. The technological and economic limitations that they're facing when they think about where to put solar. And we eventually decided that for a lot of stakeholders, it would be better to approach things from a land use planning perspective. And so we've developed these 4 steps of smart solar planning and use that as a framework for the rest of the tool. And we use, I'll sort of get into a little bit more of the details here, but we really wanted everybody to come at this from a land use planning perspective and think holistically, not just about solar, but about all of the different land uses in your area. We also talk in part 2 about the benefits of why you would want to use that smart solar planning approach. We have an info dive on energy justice, which deals with considering stakeholders that may be disadvantaged or may not always have a voice, making sure that the communities are involved in the decision-making process. And we also tell folks what else they need to bring to the table. It would have been nice to include the zoning maps for the 100+ municipalities in the Hudson Valley. Obviously, that was sort of not really feasible. And so we remind people you need to have your comprehensive plans, your zoning maps, and a lot of other resources at hand. Another thing that we can't map is local knowledge. As all of you as GIS users probably know, GIS doesn't always reflect reality. Aerials can be out of date, things change on the ground. And there are also things that really can't be mapped. So knowing which farmers are going to pass on the farm down the family, which farmers may be retiring and looking to sell their land. Those sort of things need to be brought to the table as well. And finally, community values and priorities. So here in the Hudson Valley, there's a big diversity of resources, and I'm sure the same is true of Western New York. In some places there are state parks where outdoor recreation is a big part of the local economy, and other places agriculture is what's driving the local economy, or maybe a combination of the two. And so we really wanted to build a tool that doesn't tell people where to put solar, but gives locals the tools that they need to work with developers to find the best places based on their local priorities and values. So part 3, we called Learn About the Layers. There are many layers in the tool, and we decided to lay them out one by one and give users an explanation of what that layer is and how it relates to solar and solar development. And so we use the 4 steps of smart solar planning as a framework for laying out all of these layers. And we also provide a worksheet that they can either print out or download and fill out digitally. And it's basically just an outline of part 3 and lets them take notes on each of these layers, what they are, where they are in their community, that sort of thing. So as they progress through part 3, they can zoom in and out on an interactive map here, and they can set the extent to their town, their neighborhood, their county, whatever they want. And the cool thing about this is that the map extent will stay fixed, but the layers will flip on and off depending on which layer we're discussing in that part. So step 1 of the steps of smart solar planning is to assess existing development patterns. And we've given the user a land use map here. This is the National Land Cover Database data set. And for folks that aren't familiar with reading a land cover map, we provide an info dive on the broad strokes of how to do that, and we provide text here that they can scroll through, to guide them, sort of look at where your most developed areas are, where your open space is, your agricultural lands, etc. Part 2 of smart solar planning, step 2 of smart solar planning is identifying opportunity areas, and we have 3 different layers to help folks to do this. The first is an EPA data set that the EPA compiled called Repowering Opportunities. And this is based on remediation sites, so Superfund sites, brownfields, landfills, contaminated sites. And EPA very nicely conglomerated their data and the data from the DEC and rolled it all up into one data set and then screened it for criteria for different renewable energies. So for the solar mapping tool, we filtered it to just solar sites, but they actually do include wind sites as well. And we're streaming their data into our tool. And so when EPA updates their data, it automatically updates in the solar mapping tool. And the attributes include hyperlinks to the DEC sites that explain what the site was remediated for and whether it's safe for residential buildings, for recreational spaces, drinking water, et cetera. And so that can give you a great idea of whether you might want a different land use on the site or whether it really is best for solar where there are not a lot of people on the site. They also have a site profile where they've sort of spelled out some of their screening that they did and how much power they think can be on that site. We also have DEC permitted mined lands, and reclaimed mines can also be great sites. A lot of times they've been graded, they've been cleared of trees. And sometimes the remediation doesn't go all that well and you end up with kind of a sparse, grassy, vacant lot look. That can be a great place to put a solar field without really impacting other land uses. The last data set we have here was actually developed by Microsoft, the large building footprints. They did a machine learning exercise to use aerials to map every building footprint in the country. We filtered it to buildings larger than half an acre, about 20,000 square feet, that we think would be suitable for larger solar installations. And so as an example, you can click on this building here and see that it's 17 acres of rooftop. And the user can actually zoom into that area. So this is the Poughkeepsie Galleria Mall and some other large retail spaces, think Target and Home Depot and places like that. Within this blue box is 150 acres of rooftop and parking lot. And you could put solar on those rooftops or on that parking lot and not affect the current land use in any way, right? It's still a viable retail space. You can actually shade parking spots. You're not clearing trees. You're not taking away ag lands. So these can be great opportunities for places to put solar without negatively impacting current land use. And we did look high and low for a parking lot data set of decent resolution. We never did find one. And so, our guidance on the left-hand side, if you read through the rooftop section, sort of indicates, well, a lot of times if you see a large rooftop, there's going to be a large parking lot associated with it. So step 3 in the steps for smart solar planning is to identify those resources that you care about. And obviously this varies some town to town, and you can see the groups that we've included here, groups of different resources and layers to represent those. I'll just sort of highlight a couple of them, but there are more in the tool that I don't have time to cover. So the first is agricultural resources. As Heather was spelling out, solar can be at odds with agricultural land uses. There are also a lot of opportunities for co-locating solar and ag. And we have an info dive sort of going into some of the situations in which that can make sense and can actually be a benefit to agriculture. So there are some crops that seem to actually grow better under solar panels where they're shielded from the sun a little bit, get a little bit more moisture retention. And so you can have a dual use site like that. We are hearing from some farmers in the Hudson Valley that they're sort of struggling financially. And if they put a third of their farm, the third of their farm that is least fertile, that has the worst soils, if they do a solar lease on a third of their farm, they get a steady income from the solar lease, and then they can keep farming. And if they don't do that, then they're going to go under. They're going to be selling to the highest bidder. So there are some instances where it really does make sense to put solar on some farms. So we detail that. Heather was talking about the locations of prime soils for farming and farmland soil of statewide significance. We do have that map. Folks can zoom in and out and click on the different soils. And again, as Heather was very presciently driving at, location matters, but also total acreages matter, right? And so for the Hudson Valley, we included a table of the acreages by township. And so I had highlighted the town of Clinton there a moment ago. The town is almost 25,000 acres, and about half the town is farm soils of one type or another. But the prime soils in that township are much more limited. So if agriculture were important to the town of Clinton, they might think about, as Heather was saying, some other towns up by you all have done, limiting the proportion of prime ag soils that can be put into solar. You may, want to do that through some town code. But obviously it varies by town. It varies, how important agriculture is, what are the resources you have, and hopefully these tables just help put things in perspective. Maybe 50 acres of soil isn't the end of the world, but 2,000 acres of soil where you're losing all your prime farmland is. We also cover forests. I mentioned this forest cores data set, and again we have info dives explaining benefits of forests and a little bit more about this layer. We cover wetlands and flood zones. Flood zones is another topic where there's a little bit of nuance. And in some cases, floodplain may be a healthy wetland complex where you really don't want solar. In other cases, floodplains are going through developed areas, and there are parking lots that flood all the time. You're washing motor oil back into your waterways and really creating water quality issues. And maybe it would be better if you rip up a paved surface, put in ground mount solar and underplant that with wetland plants. And so we talk about that in the floodplain management or floodplain fringe and solar info dive. So the last step for the steps for smart solar planning is actually assessing development feasibility. And one reason to put this at the end is because this is dictated by current technology and current economic forces, and those can change. And so if you're thinking about, as a municipal stakeholder, if you're thinking about rezoning or redoing code in some way, if there's a place in your town that you think would be great for solar, but the technology isn't quite there yet, or the transmission lines aren't there, well, you want to zone appropriately for that because it may become economically feasible in the future to build more transmission lines or build distribution lines. And so, we have one town in our area, they would like to see solar on a capped landfill that the town owns to generate some income for the town. The landfill really isn't going to be used for anything else. So they might want to make sure that the zoning reflects that desire, even though the power lines don't currently allow for that. As Heather was saying again, great presentation. A lot of times farmland and solar have similar alignment in terms of flat, well-drained land. So we developed using a digital elevation model, a DEM, this slope and aspect or landforms feasibility layer for solar. And so we're basically, the areas in blue are the flatter and more south-facing areas. The areas in red are the steepest or most north-facing areas. This is the only layer that we actually created for this tool. And again, we did it with a publicly available DEM, so it could easily be replicated in your neck of the woods. One problem was our DEM was not a high enough resolution. And so the pixels here are something like 30 by 30 meters, I believe. So it's good at a town scale. Once you start zooming into the site, you're better off using a finer scale topo map or something like that. But we at least sort of get the idea across, and you can see in broad strokes where in a given township or county those flatter areas are that are going to be more suitable for solar. We also have the hosting capacity. We had to work with the joint utilities, which is sort of a convening group for all of the utilities in New York State, to try to get these data streamed in from the utilities into our map. We did that for the 5 utilities that cover the Hudson Valley, but each utility has its own publicly available hosting capacity map as well. And hosting capacity is basically the amount of space left on a line to add more distributed generation. So to add another smaller scale solar project to the line, is there enough space to add that solar project without having to upgrade the line? And when I say distribution lines, we're talking about these guys here, you know, the 3-phase wooden pole type lines that go from a substation to a building. So we have hosting capacity there. This is, I think, one of the most technical layers in the tool. And so we do have another info dive to tell users sort of how to read these numbers and which numbers to pay the most attention to. So that's hosting capacity. We also, as Heather said, we have transmission lines mapped. This is from a national data set, and we, because the data set is just lines, it's simple enough that we didn't have to clip it to our region. So this does cover the whole state, as Heather said, or you can download the data set yourself for desktop use. So when we say high voltage transmission lines, this is what we're talking about. And as Heather said, the larger scale projects, those projects that tend to be, you know, hundreds of acres, are generally going to be along these transmission lines. So that was parts 1 through 3. In part 4, as I said, the rubber meets the road. The user gets all the control. They get all the layers at their disposal. Again, if you're not a normal GIS user, which I realize you all are, this could be a little bit overwhelming. So we have some cheat sheets for users explaining what all these widgets are. We have a link button up here, including to our data sources document, which may be of interest to some of you. Again, all the layers in the tool are basically publicly accessible. And then the layers, again, are grouped into these layer groups. And so we developed icons for each. There's a cheat sheet for that as well. But users will also find that if they hover over this icon, it'll pop up and tell them which group it is. So they can click on this and they can turn on and off any layers they want. So they have a measure tool. They can draw a polygon or mark a site with a pin. There's some very primitive printing functions thanks to Esri. You can change base maps down here. A lot of functionality. Now, as all of you probably know, if you turn on 40 layers at once, A, the thing's going to crash, and B, you can't see anything anyway. So again, we have guidance on the left-hand side with these different examples that sort of suggest to users who may not sort of know where to start now that they have all the layers. Okay, try turning on this layer and that layer at the same time and think about this. Try turning on these 2 other layers and now think about that. And we also have some throwbacks to some of the info dives for the more complex topics. So just to kind of reiterate what the solar mapping tool does and doesn't do, you know, we're trying to guide learning and inform discussion here. We're trying to get solar developers and other local constituents on the same page and distill complex information. One of the things we heard from solar developers when we were developing the project is that they were all for this tool because they find that, you know, a lot of planning boards, zoning boards don't even know what questions to ask, let alone how to understand the answers, because solar is fundamentally different from other types of development in some ways, right? If it's a ground mount solar project that's responsibly planted underneath, then you're not adding impervious surface necessarily. You're not adding traffic. You know, it's very much different in some ways from, say, a housing development. It's also a temporary land use. You can have 25 or 30-year solar leases, at which point they pull the posts out of the ground that the panels are mounted on, and you could conceivably go back to farming it or, you know, go back to having it be green space. Probably not likely with buildings and parking lots, right? So we're trying to distill all this complex information and make this topic as accessible as possible for as many different groups as possible. We're not trying to tell people where to put solar or not to put solar. We obviously can't replace local knowledge. We can't replace the regulatory process. And we sort of had to provide an overview and you know, couldn't include all data sets on a given topic, but hopefully we're hitting the sweet spot in terms of providing enough information to enough users to really make this thing useful. I do want to mention our replication guide. Again, we are working in 10 or 11 counties of the Hudson Valley, and a lot of our layers were clipped to that spatial extent just so that the tool functions fairly quickly. But all of the layers are publicly available or can be easily replicated. The replication guide is sort of a conceptual framework. So if you wanted to create something like this for Western New York, here's how we went about it, how you might want to think about going about it. And there's also an appendix that details for each data layer kind of what our thinking was on why we included it, some other options and why we didn't include those and things like that. So I do want to leave plenty of time for questions. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me as well. I'm happy to kind of field any questions either on solar and how to solar now, or more technical on the GIS side to the best of my ability.
Thank you for that great presentation. If anybody has any questions, nobody's posted any in the chat, but you can post them now, or you can also email our presenters. So.
Okay, and I'm just going to plop our website and my email address in the chat too, so folks can copy and paste those if they like.
Okay.
All right, no questions yet. Heather, I found your talk so fascinating, and I think there are a lot of similarities between some of the pressures that municipalities in particular are facing in dealing with some of these proposals, but also interesting to see the differences between the Hudson Valley and your neck of the woods. And I think one of the biggest differences is probably scale. Our farms tend to be a lot smaller down here. Parcel sizes are probably smaller, and the scale of solar is often, though not always, smaller. We are seeing at least a handful of utility scale solar projects down here as well. We have two that are immediately adjacent to each other that collectively cover about 1,500 acres of project area and about 900 acres of proposed panel area. So we've been dealing with that a little bit down here as well.
And that kind of size of a project where you are is looks a lot different than it does here. And I've been intrigued by your solar mapping tool in the co-location of solar on parking lots, for example, or in shopping centers. Interesting opportunities there for kind of a smaller scale contribution to solar development in New York.
Right, and part of the dynamic I think in the state is that a lot of the demand is in the city and the metro, New York City metro area, right? And so down there they have a lot more parking lots and a lot more large rooftops. And so as much as we can encourage folks in the lower Hudson Valley and the New York City area to be taking more advantage of those types of opportunities, that adds up to a lot more acreage, and the supply is then closer to the demand. I think another interesting facet is the state has done environmental impact assessments for this newest Climate Act, and the overall finding is generally that they're not going to need that many ag acres to make this happen. And so when you look at the total ag acreage in the state, it's a very small percentage that it could be converted to solar. But I think, as your presentation shows very well, and as we see here in the Hudson Valley to a certain degree too, the spatial distribution matters too, right? And if you put it all in one community, it can have very outsized impacts.
I'd say Western New York, Finger Lakes are providing quite a bit towards the renewable energy goal of the state. If you look at the numbers even further west in Erie County, because of all of the transmission lines they have for Niagara, with the hydroelectric already in place. Yeah. we are doing quite a bit of contribution to the renewable portfolio, solar and wind, from this region. We're the renewable parking lots of the state.
Yeah, one thing I did want to mention with regard to the solar mapping tool and using it in your neck of the woods, in our solar feasibility layers, there is a layer of the coverage areas for each utility in New York. And we did not, we got, I think you all have NYSEG, I believe, in Livingston County, is that right?
And
And
National Grid and
National Grid. So we have NYSEG and National Grid hosting capacity in our map. And I believe they're showing up in your area. If you go north a little bit towards Rochester, I think it's Rochester Gas and Electric. We don't have their hosting capacity layer in our map, but it is publicly available. Some of the utilities make it very easy to access these maps, others much less so. National Grid, for instance, just makes you, make a login and provide an email address. And there's just a few extra hoops. And to use the solar mapping tool, we actually have an email login or an email requirement. You just have to put in your email. It's very easy, but that was because the utilities wanted to be able to know which email addresses were accessing these maps. Some did, some didn't. So hopefully, folks in the Rochester area can get onto the Rochester hosting capacity maps without too many problems.
Okay, so the only posts I've seen on the chat have been some thank yous. So if there are no questions, then thank you so much for presenting.
Thanks for having us. And
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Heather, for roping me into this.
Anytime, Alex.
Well, everyone have a good day.
You
Take
too.
care, all.